All right, y'all, we're back again. Today I'm here to talk to you about my favorite stacks of the 2019 fantasy football season. Now, I'm going to assume that you already know what a stack is and why it's potentially beneficial, but if not, no worries. Just get your finger ready to pause this video right about now. All right, now that we got that out of the way, one other disclaimer. I'm not going to waste your time by talking about any super obvious stacks, a la Baker Mayfield to Odell Beckham Jr. Are they going to put up video game style numbers this year? Probably. Do you need me to tell you that on this video? No. So we're going to spend our time talking about a little bit more creative and unique stacks that you can put together in the middle and later rounds of your drafts. I've spent most of the summer drafting fantasy football teams in large field tournaments. In these structures, you really do want to differentiate and find those unique combinations that will separate you from, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of competitors. We're also talking primarily about best ball, which makes these Hail Mary style stacks a little more justifiable, more viable, and honestly just a lot more fun to put together. If you're not familiar with the best ball format or the type of tournaments that I'm referring to, basically just go watch any of my other videos from this summer because that is the subject matter of all of them. Also, at the end of this video, I do have a promo code for you to join the Draft app, which is the hosting site for these type of tournaments. We're going to spend most of today talking about 3-player stacks. Now, traditionally in a 3-player stack, you are always going to need to draft the quarterback of the NFL team that you're targeting. That's just sort of key to the whole concept. After that, you're going to take 2 of either the running back, wide receiver, or tight end pool from that NFL team. Generally speaking, you'd only want to choose 1 at each of those positions to avoid cannibalism, but there are exceptions to this rule. For example, in this offseason, I've taken a lot of stacks that include Jameis Winston, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin, all from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 2 wide receivers. This is rare, but in this scenario, the thought process is that the Tampa Bay Bucs are going to score a lot of points in 2019, and that either Mike Evans or Chris Godwin are likely to lead the team in receptions on a week-to-week basis. So in a best ball format, you've got all the combinations covered, and you're going to get the benefit of that most weeks. But for the sake of today's discussion, we are going to focus on 2 independent positions to pair with the quarterbacks of the teams that we're talking about. And we're going to kick things off with the freest of the free. This is literally the cheapest, inexpensive stack I could possibly recommend for you. And what I mean by that is that you can take these 3 players with the last 3 rounds of your draft. For that to happen, we need to go to Washington, D.C., where unfortunately I feel that they are probably going to have one of the worst NFL teams this season and will presumably be passing the ball frequently. For that reason, we're going to take quarterback Dwayne Haskins, wide receiver Trey Quinn, and running back Chris Thompson. Now, Chris Thompson is technically 3rd on the depth chart behind Darius Geis and Adrian Peterson, but we all know what that really means. It means he's the passing down back because that's been his role in Washington for a number of years, and he's actually been quite productive in that role when he's on the field. Injuries have plagued this guy's career, but believe it or not, 2 seasons ago, there was actually an 8 or 10 week stretch of the year where he was a top 10 running back in PPR formats. So we're hoping that he can regain some of that glory in 2019, but if he doesn't or he's not on the field as often as we'd like him to be, honestly, you didn't invest that much at the very end of your draft. Trey Quinn, if you've watched any of my videos this summer, you know that I'm super high on this player. He's someone that I really enjoyed watching towards the end of last year, and he has now been officially named the starting slot receiver in Washington. Slot receiver is a great position to target in fantasy, particularly on NFL teams that are not going to perform well on a week-to-week basis. The reason for that is because in the second half, the 3rd and 4th quarter of games, if the opposing defense is ahead, they're going to switch to more of a bend but don't break style of defense, which opens up a lot of routes in the middle of the field. And slot receivers in general, in this case, Trey Quinn specifically, is the beneficiary of that. Lastly, Haskins was the number 1 pick of the Washington Redskins, and number 1 picks do not sit on the bench very long, particularly for a losing team. By week 5 or 6, the fans, the ownership, coaching, management, everybody's clamoring to see what the guy can do and see if he can turn the team's fortunes around. So who knows? A month from now, we might even be talking about Dwayne Haskins being the week 1 starter, but I would say no later than week 6. He will be the guy in Washington. Let's head down to South Beach, where my favorite Miami Dolphins receiver is, and for the last few years has been, Kenny Stills. Perennial preseason darling Devontae Parker is at it again. I've seen some glowing articles written about him projecting a big 2019 season. Unfortunately, I've seen these articles in each of the preceding years, and it never seems to pan out that way. I'm certainly not rooting against the guy, but generally speaking, the best prediction of future behavior is past behavior. And in that regard, Kenny Stills was actually very productive 2 seasons ago. Theoretically, we should get some improved quarterback play in Miami this year, and I like Kenny Stills as the receiver to own there. I pair him up with tight end Mike Gesicki, who's entering his second year after an incredibly quiet rookie campaign. But a lot of tight ends do not produce in their first year, and they break out in years 2 and 3. We're hoping for increased targets, receptions, touchdowns, and yardage out of Gesicki because I liked him a lot coming out of Penn State in last year's draft. The real question in Miami is which quarterback do you take to complete this stack? Now listen, neither of these guys are going to be my starting quarterback, so I think that sort of answers the question for us. Is your starting quarterback's bye week in the first half of the season or the second half? If it's in week 8 or earlier, I would probably go with Fitzpatrick because he will probably still be the starter in Miami up until then. If your quarterback has their bye week in week 9 or later, I would probably roll the dice with Rosen because I think that's exactly what the Miami Dolphins are going to do by the time they get to that point in the season. This does bring up a bigger issue that I should probably note, which is that most of the stack building I do would be considered my backup positions. In rounds 1 through 7, 8, 9 of a draft, I'm just going to choose the best player available, regardless of what team they play for. And then I like to build these little mini stacks as my backups. Oftentimes, I'll choose 2 NFL teams that end up being the backups to what would be considered my starting players, if that makes sense. I hope it does. But what I'm trying to say is that for those guys in the 3rd and 4th tier at each player pool to ever hit your scoreboard, they would have to have a monster week anyway. So it makes a lot more sense to me to stack those players than it does the starters. In any case, let's move on and talk about some higher profile NFL teams that have some names on their roster that might be more recognizable to the average NFL fan or fantasy player, but that I think are actually undervalued at this point in the summer. Up in Detroit, Matt Stafford has found himself being drafted in the bottom 3rd of NFL quarterbacks, which candidly surprises me because this guy has been a solid fantasy producer for most of his career, and I don't see any reason to think that the Lions aren't going to be better this year than they were last year. So I like to take Matt Stafford, sometimes even as my starting quarterback, and I will pair him up with wide receiver Marvin Jones. Now the Kenny Golladay hype train is real. It has left the station, but I'm of the camp that believes Marvin Jones could and might even be likely to outperform Golladay this season, even though you can get him multiple rounds later. To complete the trifecta in Detroit, I like to take rookie tight end TJ Hawkinson. Generally speaking, you do want to stay away from rookie tight ends. They have a long history of not producing, but there are some exceptions, and there have been some rookie breakouts previously. TJ Hawkinson is about as good a candidate for that as anybody. He was the number 1 tight end taken in this year's draft. It was in the first round, and obviously the Detroit Lions like him a lot. So that is the threesome that I choose out of Detroit. Let's travel across the Great Lakes over to Chicago and talk about Mitch Trubisky, Allen Robinson, and Tariq Cohen. If you're going to take a running back in a fantasy football stack, it really needs to be the pass catching back. Obviously, if you took the bell cow that gets 100 to 150 yards a game, that's counterproductive to what the quarterback is going to do, and it really doesn't make sense. Now, this is not a concern in Chicago, where Tariq Cohen is the definition of a pass catching back, and I think there's some value to be had because of that. There's a lot of excitement about the rookie coming in there to be the primary back, but I don't really see any reason to think that Tariq Cohen's role is going to change. He might be better in best ball than he is in redraft because sometimes it is hard to predict when those monster games are going to come from him, but he's a player that I think will absolutely contribute to your team this year, and I'm still drafting him frequently. Allen Robinson was a star wide receiver in the fantasy community, someone that we were all very excited about 2 years ago. After a couple lackluster seasons, people seem to have forgotten about him, but he is the guy in Chicago, and if he stays healthy and they continue to improve their chemistry and their passing ability, he will be the beneficiary. Mitch Trubisky has improved in each of his first 2 seasons. From a throwing standpoint, he's always been fantasy viable because he can run, but I think that this is the year they put it all together, and that is an offense that you want to buy shares of. Over in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, there's a lot of anticipation heading into this year to see which new names and faces are going to emerge and become fantasy football relevant. This is, of course, in the wake of 2 megastars having left town and the void that they leave behind for a couple young guys to step up and become stars. But before we talk about that, let's talk about an old familiar face, Ben Roethlisberger. Much like Matt Stafford, a guy that I'm still happy to take as my quarterback 1 as he slides down the draft board. Fellow drafters are getting excited on hopes and dreams of what the young guys, the rookies, can do. Give me old reliable. Big Ben does it year in and year out, and I don't see any reason to think he won't do it again this year. I like to pair him up with wide receiver James Washington in his second year out of Oklahoma State. A lot of people think that Dante Moncrief is the guy to own, that he will be the number 2 receiver behind Juju. Listen, I'm a James Washington guy, but choose your flavor. Their ADP, their average draft position is almost identical, and you can choose whichever one you like. Either way, I want to pair them with Jalen Samuels. This was one of the most interesting tidbits that came out of the offseason to me. The Pittsburgh Steelers hired a coach out of North Carolina State to be their running backs coach. Just so happens to be Jalen Samuels' college coach. Now, you'll remember Jalen from last year because he had tight end and running back eligibility in some formats. That's what made most of us aware of him. But listen, are you sold on James Conner? Maybe you are, maybe you're not, but there still has to be a passing down back in Pittsburgh. I like Jalen Samuels and his college coach to get him some extra targets in 2019. So as you can probably tell by now, I'm a big advocate of waiting on quarterback. It's generally the last position that I address in these drafts, but every once in a while you do get an itchy trigger finger and you just want to take one a little bit earlier. It might be one of those rounds where there's just no running backs or wide receivers that are jumping out at you, and that's where I look over and see who's available, and I find myself recently taking a lot of Matt Ryan. I heard that the Atlanta Falcons have 13 domed football games this year. I couldn't believe that was true. I went and looked it up. It is true. They always have 8 at home each season, but this year they're getting an additional 5 on the road. This seems particularly relevant to me as we get into November and December, and again, championship weeks in fantasy football. 13 out of their 16 football games this year will be played indoors. So I'm taking Matt Ryan. I like to pair him up with Ito Smith, once again, the pass-catching back on that team. And then you can either go with Austin Hooper at tight end, who I like a lot this year, or you could even go with Mohamed Sanu, an unheralded receiver that, again, continues to produce. You might consider him the third guy on that team, but he's going to get his. Very similar situation down in Arizona. If you want to take Kyler Murray early and then choose 2 of these guys, your guess is as good as mine which 2 to take, but some of them are definitely going to produce. One thing I do want to make clear is that I don't go into any draft with a specific stack in mind. I let the draft fall to me, and I have an idea of all these combinations of players that I might want to put together, but I would not recommend you go in with a specific plan because that's going to lead to bad drafting and stretching to get specific players. Just have an idea of what you might want to do, and if it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, be willing to hit the eject button and don't sacrifice your team just for the sake of putting together a stack. Let's do some quick hits. 2-player stacks, which are essentially just a quarterback and a wide receiver that I like pairing together when I can. So up in Buffalo, you got Josh Allen and John Brown. I think these two are going to be a dynamic duo. I think they're both going to outperform their ADP, and I love pairing them together. Down in Dallas, you got Dak Prescott and Michael Gallup. You really started to feel their chemistry come together at the end of last year. Gallup had a few big games. I expect more of the same in 2019. And there's not going to be a lot of people that back me up on this one, but give me Marcus Mariota and A.J. Brown in Tennessee. I know a lot of people have soured on Mariota. He's had a lot of lingering injuries. I don't know if the guy can perform without those, but I'm hoping he can. And A.J. Brown goes undrafted in a lot of leagues. Put them together and let's see what happens. So if you haven't already, you can sign up for Draft at draft.com, or you can download the Draft app. They are owned by FanDuel, and they are a quality product. At this point, it is by far my favorite form of fantasy football, and I'm in there every day drafting. Come sign up and jump into a draft with me. You can take all the players that I just recommended right before my pick and snipe me. But when you do sign up, use the promo code 12FLUID because that will get you a sign-up bonus, and it also helps support this channel, which I certainly appreciate. You can also follow me on Twitter at 12FLUID. I will be back in August to talk to you about my roundup of all my fantasy teams. I'll probably be over 200 drafted at that point. I'll show you my top owned players, and we will talk about expectations heading into kickoff of the 2019 NFL season.